And those are in the names of McDonald, Howlin, Barrett and Burton.
I propose to take questions 1 to 4 together. The National Economic and Social Council is an independent statutory agency operating on the aegis of my department. The Council analyses and reports on strategic policy matters relevant to Ireland's economic, social, environmental and sustainable development. In accordance with the NESDO Act 2006, I have certain functions such as appointing the members of the NESC, presenting reports to Government prior to publication or prior to the laying before the Houses, as is the case of the annual reports. The Council is funded through my department's vote, and my department also has governance responsibilities in relation to the Council. The NESC membership comprises representatives of business and employer organisations, ICTU, agricultural and farming organisations, community and voluntary organisations and environmental organisations, together with heads of government, departments and independent experts. This composition means that it plays an important and unique role in bringing different perspectives from civil society together with government. It helps NESC to analyse the challenges facing Irish society and to develop a shared understanding among its members of how we can meet these challenges. The recent NESC reports are urban development land, housing and infrastructure, fixing Ireland's broken system and moving from welfare to work, low work intensity households and the quality of supportive services. I brought both reports to Government in advance of their publication. The Council has recently adopted its work programme for the year to September 2019. It comprises 3 themes, one being housing and land, transport-led development, second, social insurance and the welfare system towards a sustainable developmental welfare state, and also climate change and low carbon transition. The Programme for Partnership Government specifically notes that there are policy challenges where long-term thinking is required, and I hope and trust that the Council will continue to contribute to policy development with a focus on the strategic and longer-term view.
First, as tabled, Deputy McDonald, supplementary.
Taoiseach, one of those key long-term challenges that requires long-term planning is climate change and the transition to a low-carbon economy. And I know one of the main areas of the work of the NESC is in this arena. Last week, Taoiseach, the European Parliament approved 4 of the 8 proposals comprising its clean energy package for 2020 to 2030. The directives in question originally had binding renewable energy targets in place for each EU member state to achieve, but regrettably national targets have now been removed in favour of an overall EU-wide target. Under the current 2020 targets, this state faces hefty fines for not meeting our 20% energy efficiency and 16% renewable energy targets. Currently, our shift to renewable energy is not even touching 10%, and this we should regard as an abject failure. Without a binding target for 2030, where is the incentive for us to make real significant changes in respect of climate change policy? The Climate Change Action Network Europe have reported in the past that Ireland has played a negative role in climate change negotiations, so it is possible, if not probable, that your government played a part in removing national targets during negotiations on the important directives agreed just last week. So perhaps, Taoiseach, you might enlighten us as to your government's position on this.
As tabled, Deputy Howlin.
NESC is an important forum, as the Taoiseach has rightly said, where workers' representatives through the trade unions meet with employers' groups and government. They've done over the years an amount of important background research work that informs national policy on areas like public housing and so on. The set of priorities that the Taoiseach has indicated for NESC into the future do include, as Deputy McDonald has said, the whole issue of climate change. I've said recently at our own party conference that this is one of the moral imperatives of our time. And I genuinely believe that public opinion is light years ahead of opinion in this House, and certainly ahead of opinion within the government, which talks the talk But in terms of actually achieving the targets, we are pitifully bad. We're not going to meet our 2020 target, and there's no rescuing that at this stage. But it's highly likely that we won't meet our 2030 target, which really would be shameful. Not only because it is an indictment of this generation and the whole issue of generational solidarity, but also because it is economically hugely damaging to us. We will have to make those changes, and the longer we delay it and change ourselves into a carbon neutral economy, the longer we delay the achievement of those targets, the more expensive it will be, because the fines that will accrue to the state at that stage will be extremely severe. So I'd ask the Taoiseach, in terms of the work programme of NESC, to inform the government whether he will make it clear that in terms of national priorities on the economy, on social policy, that climate change is a priority, and carbon reduction and carbon abatement will be practically implemented as a matter of urgency.
Next is tabled Deputy by Barrett.
Taoiseach, have you read the NESC report produced in April 2018 on land management? And the reason I ask you that is because it will explain to you what those of us who are going to be marching for emergency action on the housing and homelessness emergency on December the 1st, what we are looking for. The sort of radical change in policy that we are looking for. Because what the NESC report does is sets out examples of what they do in places like the Netherlands and Austria, and the contrast with the policies that you have pursued in housing are stark in the extreme. It points out that, for example, in Amsterdam, 80% of zone building land is in the hands of the state. They don't sell it. They don't sell it. And 30% of the housing, Dutch housing stock, is social housing. That contrasts with 5% here. 5%, because of the failure of the government to build social housing. In Austria, between 2000 and 2014, the austerity years, when you slashed housing budgets, helping to generate the current housing crisis, the Austrians did the exact opposite. Between 28 and 36% of all housing built in Austria in that period was social housing. Extraordinary. When we stopped building social housing, they were building more than 30% of all housing output was social housing. So do you see the point, Taoiseach? You're selling off public land, you're allowing the private market to dictate. We have a disaster, but in other countries in Europe, they keep land in public use, they have strict land management policies, and they build large amounts of social housing.
Deputy Joan Burton.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. The NESC has done very valuable work in relation to housing. And I wonder, Taoiseach, if you have had an opportunity to have a conversation or to address them or meet them recently, to basically ask about why, for instance, the scheme launched with a great fanfare by the government for affordable housing in Rebuilding Ireland, that we have a recent report which actually shows that of 1,000 applications, only 60 loans were drawn down. And that in the city of Dublin, you're only talking about actually 20 loans being drawn down. Now, we're talking about people who have a joint income of around 75,000 or who have an individual income of 50,000. So we're talking, for instance, about people like skilled tradespeople towards the beginning of their career. And they are being turned down for these loans, which your Minister for Housing launched as a cornerstone of housing recovery. Now, I happen to agree with the Minister that affordable housing is absolutely critical to solving the housing crisis. And I wonder, with all of the expertise that's available from the NESC, have you taken the opportunity to have a conversation with the National Economic and Social Council as to why your housing policy in relation to just ordinary people with decent jobs and an income which has passed the test, they are unable to gain affordable housing in the way their mother and fathers could get affordable housing. Fine Gael has actually taken away the right of people to have an affordable house. You're great on the public promotion, but when we have a report showing that in fact the actual policy is simply producing minute numbers, 60 out of 1,000. How can anyone stand over that after all the months?
The Desk has been allocating a lot of its time in the past 2 years in trying to prompt a more substantive series of actions on two of the most pressing and critical issues of today. Firstly, the housing emergency, and secondly, the climate emergency. What is not clear is whether the Council's work is having any impact at political level in government. And in relation to housing, the Council has presented work, both its own and that of conference speakers, to achieve a more sustainable impact on rough sleeping, for example, and land use. 2 weeks ago, a man sleeping rough in a public park about 1.5 miles from here became the 27th person to die on the streets of Dublin in less than a year and a half. In response, the Junior Minister for Housing claimed that enormous progress is underway and that there will be no issue with the number of beds this winter. This was very quickly followed by Father Peter McVerry, who said that it already appears to him that there are more rough sleepers today than there were last year. He pointed out that the government continued to miss the fundamental point that a bed for rough sleepers would only be used if people felt that they would be safe accessing the service. He actually said of the most recent claims, quote, "I don't see any evidence of them learning," unquote. Can you reply to this, Taoiseach? Do you disagree with his point that many homeless people are reluctant to access beds because they are scared for their own safety? Isn't there something terrible about the idea that people would rather risk sleeping rough than accessing and entering some of our services? Can you tell us if you are confident that the policies and services are in place to stop this unprecedented level of deaths on the streets of our capital, and in particular this winter, to prevent them?
Deputy Ryan.
Last week at our Climate Action Committee, I set out some of the institutional arrangements that I felt we needed to take up within the state to address this issue, not having a big outside agency telling us what to do, but using existing resources. Can I just say briefly, first of all, that I think that the Secretariat of the National Economic and Social Council could and should have a key role advising your department in that coordination role that they have in how we tackle climate change. That as I understand, you want something similar to the Action Plan of Jobs, which was run by your department for climate. That makes sense. But I think NESC, in their report in 2012 on how we get a circular, iterative approach to addressing this issue, could give real practical advice and assistance to your department in that regard. Beneath that, I think we should give further resources to the Climate Advisory Committee chaired by John Fitzgerald to improve their work. We need a new Just Transition Commission, which we set out in legislation here recently, which would assist the members of the National Economic and Social Council where there are transition difficulties. It would provide a mediation service to get over those. We need a new Green Investment Bank. And last but not least, we need to change the delivery board for the National Development Plan, which is chaired by the Secretary-General of PER with the Secretary-General of Housing, to a delivery board for a climate development plan, chaired by PER, and I believe it should be co-chaired by the Secretary-General of the Department of Climate Action. But I think NESC Secretariat in particular have a critical role in getting the coordination that your party has to be responsible for you, and can I commend that approach to the government?
He should respond.
Thanks very much. Just in relation to the clean energy package, I'm not across the details on that. I imagine it was handled either by Minister Bruton or Minister Naughton before him, or perhaps by their respective officials. I think the advantage, though, perhaps of EU-wide targets is that it allows for burden sharing. So if you set an EU-wide target, you can have some countries that may do well, other countries that aren't doing as well, and you can offset the targets against each other. So One country might meet its target in one area but not in another area. Another country may meet it in the other area but not the first area, and you can offset it against each other. And often in these negotiations, they're done through the big blocs, with the EU negotiating on behalf of all of us, China negotiating, India, America, and so on. CO2 emissions are, of course, lower than they were, notwithstanding an increase in population and a very significant increase in our population. But we're nowhere near close to reaching our target of a 20% reduction. The reduction we're going to achieve by 2020 is closer to 1% than 20%, so it is evident that we won't reach our 2020 targets. But I do think we will reach our 2030 targets, and I'm determined that we should do so, both for renewable energy and for CO2 emissions. Project Ireland 2040 will bring us about 1/3 of the way to doing that, and that's through the investment in energy, both renewables and grid. It's through investment in transport and also investment in insulating homes and public buildings. Other things will make a difference too as well. Carbon tax, if we get it right, can make a difference, and also other changes as well. And we need to put them all together, particularly changes in agriculture too. On the report on land management, yeah, I did read it actually. I thought it was a very good report from NESC. And in fact, that report on land management was very much the report that informed the government when it came to the decision to establish the Land Development Agency, which is modelled on similar agencies in Netherlands and Austria. So, you know, the decision to set up the LDA very much drew from that report, and very much is following on from the success that they've had in Netherlands and to a lesser extent Austria. And the purpose of the Land Development Agency, as the House will be aware, is to develop publicly owned land for housing, housing of all sorts, public housing and private housing, social, cost rental, the whole suite of housing, because housing of all types is needed in Ireland. And also its role will be to acquire land banks, to acquire privately owned land, to acquire land that may be developed and zoned in the future. So it's very much following the advice of that report, and very much in line with the model in Netherlands. Indeed, that's what the people working on it have gone to examine, to see how we can do things like that here. Cost rental is huge in Vienna, and you'll be aware that we're doing our first major cost rental project on Emmett Road, very much following from the Austrian experience, and the LDA is very much modelled on what's been done in the Netherlands, a government agency taking a much more active role in developing housing and also acquiring and putting together land banks for development. If you take 2018, for example, we estimate, and this is excluding ghost estates being brought back into use, it's excluding student accommodation, it's excluding reconnections of abandoned homes. We estimate that about 18,000 new homes and apartments will be built this year in Ireland. We know 5,000 alone were built in the last 3 months. Of those, 4,000 are social housing. That's direct builds by local authorities and also by affordable housing bodies. So that would indicate that in terms of the new builds being built this year, between 20 and 25% are social housing, which is exactly the kind of figure that you have been advocating, that roughly 20 to 25% of homes should be social housing or public housing. That's kind of where we are this year. We're just not there in terms of quantum. And what we want to get to is a build of about 35,000 a year, of which 10 to 12,000 would be social housing or public housing, if you prefer that term. So again, somewhere between a quarter and a third. So listening to Deputy Boyd Barrett, I'm sure he'd be horrified to hear this. I think he's describing for me. I think he's just describing for me our actual policies. This is exactly what we're doing. And Netherlands, they do, with public land, partner with private industry and provide a mix of housing. Just in terms of rough sleeping, the latest count, as Deputy Martin will know, has rough sleeping down about 40%, but there's a new count due quite soon, and I've no idea what the outcome of that will be. I think we all understand that rough sleeping is a complex social phenomenon. It's not just about housing. It's also about mental health. It's about addiction, alcohol, drugs, family breakup. Often people have had trouble with the law. Many are non-EU migrants as well. And it's a very complex social problem, and these are people with enormous needs and need a lot of help. And I had the opportunity to visit Merchants Quay last night just to get a better feel for the kind of services they provide and to meet some of the people who use those services, many of whom are rough sleepers. And when you get a feel for the diversity of people who sleep rough, and I've been out with Safety Net as well to meet people who are sleeping rough and living in tents and so on. When you get a feel for the individual stories behind people, you can understand why they may not wish to accept a bed or accept accommodation. And it's for lots of different reasons, and they're very individual reasons in different circumstances. But what we are doing a lot of work with is with the Peter McVerry Trust on Housing First. And Housing First is a programme whereby we assist rough sleepers to get into housing, put the wraparound supports around them so they actually are able to hold on to the housing, because we know a lot of rough sleepers, when they get accommodation, when they get an apartment, for various reasons, aren't able to hold on to it. And we've seen a lot of success with Housing First. If you provide housing for somebody who's been rough sleeping but continue to have the supports around them, there's a much better chance that they'll stay in their housing. And that's a partnership that we have with Peter McVerry Trust, and I think with Focus as well. And actually has worked extremely well.